He led an old man back to town, never dreaming that one kind act would change his life forever. The wind in Dustorn cut like broken glass as Ethan Walsh pushed on, boots talking with every step. Behind him, saloon laughter snapped like a whip ahead, Red Canyon Pass crouched in white. He meant to keep walking. Save the potatoes. Save the bread heel. Save the night for Sarah and 8-year-old Emily. Then he saw a shape by a rock. An old man slumped like a dropped coat, steam feathering from cracked lips. "I don't know where I am," the stranger breathed. Ethan lowered the sack while the man's eyes flicked past his shoulder as if expecting someone else. Ethan knelt. Beneath a ragged sleeve glinted a silver bracelet etched with tiny numbers. Ink rimmed the man's knuckles. Fresh horse tracks ringed the spot. 2 mounts circling once, then turning back toward town. In the snow lay a torn scrap of paper, edges singed. A hand-drawn map marked with a single cross. He opened the man's coat for warmth and felt a stiff ridge sewn inside the lining. A sealed letter, wax cracked yet unbroken. The stranger flinched, whispering a name Ethan almost caught before the wind stole it. He looked toward Dustorn. Lanterns bobbed like coins on water. Somewhere beyond them lived men who laughed at hunger and paid to buy silence. Ethan's stomach hollered. His family needed the food. The smart move was to walk away. Yet Sarah's old rule rose like a prayer. Be better than the world. He hauled the man upright. Footsteps not theirs, ticked in the snow beyond a drift and faded. Whose tracks? Why the bracelet? What truth hid in that lining? Why did riders turn back at the pass? Ethan faced the town, and chose the hard road, not knowing which door that choice would blow open. What happens next will shock you tonight. Ethan steadied Jonah Reed's elbow as they entered Dustorn, the main street narrowed by drifts and a north wind that rattled tin signs like coins in a jar. Snow bridged wagon ruts and softened every footprint, swallowing the world into a hush broken only by their steps and the meager sway of lanterns fighting the dark. Jonah's breath came thin and quick. Each time the old man wobbled, Ethan shifted the flour sack on his shoulder and took more of the weight. Feeling bones through a coat as tired as the year, the wind found the hole in Ethan's sleeve and slid a cold finger along his arm. He kept them in the lane's brighter patches where the lamps gave guidance, where glass flickered with stubborn life. What little he had set aside for Sarah and Emily bumped his back with each stride. A reminder and a question. How far could a family stretch and still stay whole? He measured distance the way he measured meals, honestly and without complaint, counting doors and the sound of shutters as if they were mile markers. The buildings leaned inward as if to talk about the weather and the fortunes it blessed. The Breezewood Saloon threw out laughter sharp enough to cut skin. Lucas Brennan's chuckle threaded the noise with that familiar curl at the end, the one that always asked others to take part in small cruelty. Ethan angled Jonah away from the door and kept their progress steady. Wind slid under Ethan's sleeve through a thin hole he meant to mend when time allowed. A church bell wore a white cap. A stray dog crossed the street with its tail tucked, then vanished behind a stack of barrels. The mercantile window glittered with goods he could not touch this winter. Gloves with neat stitching, a tin of peppermint sticks, a cast iron pan seasoned to mirror shine. Prices sat like verdicts on cards written in a tidy hand. The scene arranged itself into 2 simple truths. Some rooms are warm because coins keep them that way. Other rooms are warmed because hands insist. Ethan's mind flinched toward memory because the present had room only for endurance. He saw Sarah Walsh's hands, skin mapped with tiny cracks from lye and cold water pulling biscuits from a pan like confidence made edible. He saw Emily on a chair too tall, legs swinging, asking if stories could fill stomachs when stew ran thick. Sarah would answer that stories were bred for the last hungry part of a person. Be better than the world, she said, not as a sermon but as a rule you wore like boots. That sentence had weight. It had lived behind his ribs for years and now pushed against the cold as if it carried coals of its own. He pressed his palm over Jonah's knuckles and felt the tremor fade a notch. Near the saloon corner, Lucas called out, not quite using Ethan's name. Lose your pride in a snowbank, kid. The boys with him were leathered without labor, gloves clean, eyes bright with borrowed bravery. Ethan set silence between them like a door. He had learned that silence could save skin, though it left bruises under the shirt. The old man stumbled and Ethan tightened his grip, feeling a flare of resolve push heat through the cold. Almost there, he murmured. Jonah nodded once like that word could be a stare. Snow lifted off the rooftops in glittering veils and vanished into the dark. The lamp over the livery swung and wrote a slow figure 8 on the street. The telegraph office sat dark. Shutters latched against the gale. Ethan marked the place with a glance. He had noticed numbers etched on the silver bracelet at the pass. A code that tugged at action. But first came shelter. He steered Jonah down a narrow lane where snow rose in soft wall. The Walsh cabin waited at the end, small and patient. Smoke from its crooked pipe drawn thin by the wind. The door stuck and then yielded to a shoulder. Warmth inside was an agreement, not a promise. The stove ticked as if counting its own heartbeat. A thin thread of smoke stitched along the ceiling and found the crack that led outside. The air smelled of iron, pine, pitch, and a stew that had given all it could. Sarah looked up from mending. Needle paused, eyes taking in everything at once. The stranger's shake. The sack's light weight. The frost in Ethan's lashes. The dip in his shoulders from the day. Fear moved through her face and then steadied into care. She crossed to the bed, lifted a blanket and wrapped it around Jonah's shoulders with the economy of someone spending the last coin. "Sit," she said, gentle but certain. "Stew's thin but it's hot." She moved to the pot, tasted and added a pinch of salt. She had meant to say, that pinch was love dressed as courage. She blew across the spoon and held it to Jonah's mouth. Steam fogged her knuckles. The old man swallowed carefully, like someone remembering how. Emily hopped from her stool, hair haloed by the lamp. She went to the trunk and pulled out her blanket, the small one with a stitched star she cherished in winter, and carried it like a crown to the chair. "It keeps the shivers quiet," she told Jonah, voice solemn, choosing kindness the way other children choose game. The old man's eyes dampened. He tried a smile, thin but true. Emily tucked the edge under his knees with the care she used for her wooden doll when storms rattled the cabin. Sarah held a spare cup to the fire until it warmed, then filled it halfway and passed it across as if heat could travel through tin into bone. Ethan crouched by the stove and rubbed life back into numb fingers. The sting rose and fell like a tide. He let the fire's breath work its slow cure and watched how Jonah's hands stopped shaking each time. Emily spoke. The man whispered a name Ethan did not know. A syllable that sounded like a letter carried too far. Sarah tilted her head. "Sir, if you recall anything, we'll help you find it," she said. Jonah shook his head, not in refusal but because a door in his mind had swollen in the damp and would not open. The bracelet's quick glint in Ethan's memory returned. Numbers meant message meant rescue, or trouble, or both. He looked at the wall where frost had traced ferns in the night and chose the next necessary thing. "I'll wake the operator," he said. Sarah weighed the words against cold, distance and duty. The pause held calculation, not doubt. She nodded. "Go. Keep your eyes up and your feet under you." Ethan slipped the bracelet from Jonah's wrist for only a moment, memorized the sequence, then returned it with care. He pulled on his coat and stepped back into the gale. The town shrank to tunnel vision, lamp to lamp. He pounded the telegraph door until a bleary man appeared, beard stuffed with sleep. "Closed." The man grunted. Ethan kept his voice even. "A lost elder needs help. These numbers will mean something to someone." The operator squinted at the sequence held near the lamp, then let his annoyance cool into duty. He unlocked the counter and moved behind the key. The operator tapped a message with gloved precision, charging double without asking, and promising only that a reply would ride the wire if the wire still had mercy. Ethan thanked him, swallowed pride and ran toward the cabin, breath counting time with his step. The street felt less empty now, as if the message itself paced him. At the door heat met him like a friend late to a fight. Jonah looked less gray. Sarah had set another quilt. Emily sat on the floor explaining how the creek froze into lace, and how every pattern seemed a map to someplace kinder. The old man listened like a man warming his hands over a story. Ethan rested a palm on the chair back and felt the grain, stubborn and alive. "Help's coming," Ethan said. Sarah exhaled a breath she had held since the latch first scraped. Gratitude flickered across her face and then hid, shy of being seen. "Then we'll have answers," she said. Jonah's eyes shone glassy with relief he could not yet name. Ethan set another log. Sparks jumped, wrote brief constellations and Wind shouldered the wall, but inside the arithmetic changed. Mercy made room where math alone would have shut the door. He thought of Lucas's laugh and let it shrink beside 12 small decisions made in less than an hour. A turn toward the pass, a hand under an elbow, a door open, a blanket given, a spoon offered, a code read, a message sent, a pride swallowed, a fire fed, a fear named, a hope allowed, a night endured. None of it felt noble. It felt necessary. He looked at Sarah, who kept dignity without turning mean, and at Emily, who parted with warmth when she had so little to spare. He looked at Jonah, whose past stood just out of sight like a rider waiting beyond the drift. Have you ever helped someone despite having little yourself? Reflect on how small acts can change lives. Candlelight wavered while Ethan Walsh studied the stranger they had hauled from Red Canyon Pass. Jonah Reed slept under Sarah's quilt. Emily's stitched star blanket folded at his knees. Frost veined the small window, the stove ticked, and the room held the hush that follows a hard choice. When Ethan tucked the blanket, a dulled silver band at Jonah's wrist caught the flame. Tiny groups of etched numbers marched along the metal in tidy segments, separated by slashes like ledger marks. He turned Jonah's arm gently, reading each cluster until the sequence settled in his head the way a trail settles under boot prints. He spoke the string once under his breath, then again slower, feeling a pull he could not name. Sarah set her mending aside and leaned close without touching the band. Telegraph code, she said, steady as bedrock. A tag to reach someone if he's found. Her eyes traveled from the bracelet to Jonah's hollow cheeks. He isn't a drifter. Emily edged nearer, solemn and curious. Does the bracelet know his home? Sarah softened. It knows how to call it. Wind pressed the door and worried the latch. Ethan weighed distance and risk. The telegraph office would be shuttered. The operator wrapped in quilts, sour at interruption. Yet the code felt like a rope thrown from a cliff. Sarah's rule rose like breath against the cold. Be better than the world. Kindness had brought the old man in from killing, whether responsibility would carry his message to the wire. Ethan slid on cracked gloves. I'll send it now, he said. Sarah wrapped her gray scarf around his throat with brisk efficiency. Emily caught his sleeve. Will the wire talk back fast? If the line still hums, he answered, and the door gave him to the storm. Cold swallowed him. The street narrowed to islands of lantern light with darkness pooled between. Doors were latched, curtains drawn. The saloon glowed behind fogged panes, loud even in weather like this. Ethan kept his eyes down, ignoring Lucas Brennan's whip-snap laugh that tried to snag pride. He counted lamps until the telegraph sign swung into view, knocking a tired rhythm against gray boards. He rapped with his knuckles. Silence. He struck harder. A bolt scraped. A bearded face appeared, temper tucked under sleep. After hours, the operator said, pushing to close. Ethan wedged his palm against the frame. Emergency. An old man at the pass with a code cut into silver. The man squinted, reading frost on Ethan's lashes and the insistence in his tone. People invent emergencies when they want favors. Ethan recited the digits slowly, careful as a man stepping river stones. Duty stirred. The operator sighed, opened the door and lit a lamp. Warmth lived grudgingly in the little room. A small stove bullied iron into service. Oil and dust scented the air. The operator dragged a ledger across the counter and slid over a pencil. Write them clean. Ethan copied the code without reversing a mark. The man raised an eyebrow, read once, then moved to the key. Brass waited like a patient insect. He flexed cold fingers and began talking to distant rooms. Taps running down the wire into the dark. At first the sounder answered with dull clicks, then rhythm formed and quickened into exchange. The operator leaned closer. When the run finished, he looked over his shoulder. Newly alert. You knocked on a loud door, he said. That tag belongs to Daniel Carver. The name struck like iron. Carver meant wide pasture, long payroll, trains carrying beef, fences at the horizon. Nobody accused the rancher of trimming wages and nobody called him gentle. Ethan's heart sprinted once and then settled. Transmit this, he said, keeping his voice even. He dictated a spare message. Man found at Red Canyon Pass, breathing but frail, sheltered at the Walsh cabin, bracelet code cited. He signed without flourish. Keys chattered. The sounder clacked and the line fell quiet. Sent, the operator said. Reply might creep in minutes or sulk until morning, depending on breaks south of the ridge. Family needs me, Ethan said, paid what was asked, and stepped back into the gale. Wind slapped him hard. He tucked the scarf higher and set a brisk pace, scanning snow like a tracker reading yesterday's story. Fresh prints cut across the ruts near the livery and bent toward the creek, larger than his boot and narrow at the heel. He paused, listened. Nothing moved except drift and dark. He carried the image anyway, a word he might need when sentences grew complicated. Light from the cabin steadied him from half a block away. He wiped his boots, knocked once out of courtesy and slipped inside. Heat met him like a task already underway. Jonah had sunk into deeper rest, lips less pale, eyelids still. Emily hummed as she twisted yarn into a chain. Sarah looked up, reading Ethan's face before she asked anything. He slid the bar and spoke one word, Carver. Relief and new tension traded places in her expression. Will that name bring wagons or riders? She asked. Blankets or ledgers? Ethan crouched to feed the fire and considered what little he knew. Depends who reaches us first, he said. If Carver's people catch the message quickly, help may arrive before dawn. If rumor runs faster, others might come sniffing to claim him or pry our door for sport. Sparks leapt and vanished. Jonah stirred and formed a thin syllable. Dan. Before sleep folded him again. Emily touched the stranger's sleeve, serious as a judge. We told the wire, she said. It will tell you're home. The old man's mouth twitched, as if memory had found a match. Sarah poured hot water over the last tea leaves and handed Ethan the second cup. He warmed his palms on tin and counted consequence instead of fear. A wealthy rancher's tag meant stature, but stature drew jealousy like a lamp draws moths. Rivals might decide opportunity lived behind their thin door. Lucas would make noise at the saloon if scraps of talk reached him. Winter tested more than lungs. It tested character. He opened the door a finger's width and listened. The lane gave only wind and a dog nosing drifts. He sealed the door again and let anxiety climb his ribs like a cold ladder. Carver's brand carried stories in bunkhouses between Dustorn and the railhead. Drives that beat storms by a day. Wages paid when promised. Quarrels settled without cheap swagger. That steadiness lived beside harder truths. Profit measured in miles. Alliances cut to fit necessity. Ethan could not predict which part of the man would ride to their threshold. He could only be ready. He sat at the table, copied the digits on a scrap so nothing would slip when questions started, and set the paper under a cup. Sarah read the figures and nodded once. You did right, she said. If he wakes hungry, I'll stretch stew with water and a prayer. Emily leaned her head against Jonah's arm and resumed humming. Minutes dragged like molasses. Ethan pressed his palm to the door, feeling weather push back. Somewhere along the wire, a clerk would wake, a foreman would frown, and a rider would be told to saddle. Jonah blinked, awareness returning in brief glimmers. Ethan crouched so the old man would not have to search the room. We sent word, he said softly. Your bracelet carried a code. The office recognized it. Jonah's gaze cleared a fraction. Name, he managed. Daniel Carver. Ethan answered. Recognition rippled across Jonah's face. Relief braided with worry. He squeezed Emily's small hand and rested again, breath evening out as if a distant door had finally unlatched. Ethan cleaned snow from his hat brim with a thumb, and looked at Sarah. They shared a glance that held plan and doubt, love and grit. She gave a tiny nod. He answered with one of his own. Outside, wind kept singing the thin song it had sung since sunset. Inside, 4 people held their place against it, sheltered by wood, heat and a decision to stand together under whatever news rode in next. He leaned his shoulder against the jamb and listened for hoofbeats. Purpose pressed as strongly as fear. A name tied to the numbers had turned a mystery into a path, and a path can be walked even when the weather argued. He set one more log, checked the latch and settled to wait, knowing dawn might bring gratitude or reckoning, rescue or trouble, perhaps both braided together like 2 strands in the same rope. What would you risk to uncover a stranger's truth? The stove ticked like a slow clock while Jonah Reed slept under layered quilts, heat bringing a faint flush that had not been there an hour earlier. His breathing rasped but no longer scratched. Warmth steadied it, threading through the room the way a hymn threads a quiet church. Sarah sat near the bed with mending in her lap that she did not touch, eyes moving between the old man's face and the kettle's lid. Emily perched on a stool, hands tucked into her sleeves, guarding the small hoard of heat with the seriousness of a sentry. Ethan stood by the window and scraped a circle through frost with his thumbnail. A smear of lantern light wobbled in the lane. Beyond it darkness pressed close. He let the glass sting his skin, and thought of the laugh that had followed him down Main Street. Lucas Brennan's easy drawl bending into ridicule. The men around that table had chuckled because it cost them nothing. Cruelty comes cheap when bellies are full. He knew how that sound could slip under a shirt and find bones. He had learned to borrow silence, to spend it when words would only buy trouble. Memory kept pace whether he invited it or not. He saw himself in the mercantile with exactly enough coins to buy potatoes and a bar of soap. The clerk weighed both with theatrical care, then suggested a price change because the storm had slowed wagons. Ethan counted the cents again, jaw tight, and put back the soap to keep food on the table. At the door Lucas stepped aside with a smile that never touched his eye. "You can wash with pride," he said. "It never runs out." That line had followed Ethan home like a stray dog that refused to leave. Jonah shifted, fingers twitching as if reaching for tools remembered by muscle more than mind. Emily leaned closer, whispering that he was safe. Sarah rose, pulled the quilt higher and tucked it at his shoulder with the efficient grace of someone who has made tight things stretch all her life. The kettle sighed. She poured hot water into a chipped cup and passed it to Ethan. He cupped it and let heat crawl into numb palm. The steam smelled of pine needles and iron, a wilderness brought to heel for a moment. The telegraph message seemed to hang in the air like frost, invisible yet present, a wire strung through his thoughts. What if no reply came? Storms broke lines, operators dozed. Maybe the code was old, owner changed. Men at the far end unwilling to be bothered by midnight appeals. Daniel Carver's name had cracked the night open with possibility, but possibility can sour into risk. Some said the rancher kept every promise like a brand. Others said he kept order with an edge that cut clean, leaving gratitude and caution braided together. Ethan looked at the table where Sarah had lined up the last potatoes as if inspection might persuade them to multiply. Emily had eaten half a biscuit earlier and then claimed she was full, sliding crumbs to the edge and pretending she was building a fort. That play had pricked him. He felt the bruise of it now, old and new at once. He closed his eyes until heat and worry blended into a single dull ache behind his ribs that refused to move on. Wind pawed the door and found the latch wanting. It rattled. He crossed the room, pressed the wood with one hand, and set the iron bar more firmly with the other. The cabin felt smaller when he turned back. One bed, two chairs, a table scarred by winters, a stove that held off the season only because they had kept faith with it. Shadows braided with lamplight made shapes on the walls that looked like maps to a world where nights ended soon. Jonah breathed in, breathed out, drifting along the sound. From the corner Sarah said his name the way she said it when she meant to steady him. "Ethan." He looked up. "We did what decent people do. If the ranch sends riders we will make room. If the ranch sends questions we will answer. If the ranch sends silence we will keep the man alive until we can do more." Her calm did not float on hope. It grew from habits set into bone. He let the words move through him. Doubt pressed back, a heavy beast, but it could not find purchase where her voice had placed courage. He sat near Jonah and watched the old man's eyelids flicker as if memory knocked at shutters. Jonah mumbled a syllable that might have been a name, might have been a place. Ethan searched the expression for any shape he could recognize. Behind that quiet study, bleak images returned. The first winter after his father died, the calf that starved because he could not carry enough hay across drifts. The day he took wages to the blacksmith for nails and came home after sundown to find Emily chasing sparks from the stove because supper had given up its last heat. The town's wealth had a way of laughing at poor men's miles. Such miles built grit, yet grit scraped. "Do you think Carver will come?" Emily asked, barely above a whisper. She hid a tremor by tucking her feet farther under her skirt. Ethan would not lie. "I think a ranch that big keeps men awake to messages. Someone will read it. Someone will ride." Saying it out loud stacked strength inside him like split sticks along the wall. He was not borrowing certainty. He was choosing it. The way you choose posture when you shoulder a load. Time in. He rose, stretched his back, and counted breaths to keep impatience from turning into restlessness. He thought of Lucas again, of boys in clean gloves who treated the town like a stage. Their laughter earlier had landed on him because it liked easy targets. He salted the memory with a truth that made it smaller. Men who require audiences cannot hold ground when storms scour the street. He pictured them stumbling home, faces flushed, boots clean only because they had not walked far. He returned to the window and scraped the frost again. A pale stripe of cloud moved like slow smoke above the lane, lit faintly by a moon that had found a chink in the weather. No hooves yet, no wheels, only the print of his earlier tracks hardening into little cups. He studied them as if answers might rise from ice. Behind him Sarah hummed a tune from years ago, something their father whistled at daybreak. It held square steadiness that steadied everything it touched. Emily matched the hum and the room felt larger for the sound. Sit, Sarah told him. Take warmth while it lasts. He obeyed, more from love than fatigue. The chair creaked in a familiar key. The fire lowered itself and then, when he nudged a new log into place, lifted again. Light ran along the bracelet's edge and put bright punctuation on Jonah's pulse. He thought of the operator's face when the code met recognition. How annoyance sharpened into attention. Recognition changes posture. It changes rooms. It might change lives, or it might draw trouble faster than help. Under the blanket, Jonah opened his eyes for one clear instant and met Ethan's gaze not as a lost man, but as someone measuring another man's worth. Gratitude crossed that small space with the speed of breath, and then fog rolled back over the shore. Ethan felt something in his chest grow taller. Whatever limped toward them. Thanks. Questions Blaine. He would meet it in the doorway without bending. The storm worried the roof again. Snow hushed its own fall. The cabin held. The wire held. Somewhere beyond the ridge, carrying their words toward a house lit later than other houses, toward a figure whose name the territory spoke with respect and caution. Between now and the knock on the door they would keep watch, tend fire and spend what little they had as if generosity were a form of wealth no thief could touch. Doubt still stalked the edge of his thinking, but hope walked there too, step for step refusing to yield ground. He rose once more and checked the latch, then sat and trimmed the lamp, lifting the flame until the chimney cleared. Soot smudged his thumb. In that small circle of light, he saw details that felt like omens. The neat stitches in Sarah's mending, Emily's careful braid, a nick in the table left by his father's knife years ago when laughter still had a place at supper. Those signs reminded him who he was, and why a stranger had found shelter under their roof. The old man's identity might bring fortune or conflict. Either way, kindness had committed them. Outside, wind shifted, dropping to a breath. He heard the creak under ice clicking like distant bees. He held himself still until a sound separated from the rest, faint and hard to place. It faded, then returned, a rhythm not born from weather. He turned his head and read Sarah's face to see whether she too had heard it. She had. Their eyes said the same thing. Be ready and do not borrow fear. Emily straightened, hands flat on her knees. The stove ticked twice as if counting down. Ethan closed his hand around the chair back, grounded by its smooth worn edge. He had done everything a man could do short of riding out himself. He had chosen mercy when hunger argued, chosen duty when comfort tempted, chosen the long road when the short one promised relief. Now the night would declare its answer. It might bring riders from Carver with blankets and thanks. It might bring silence that lasted until dawn. It might bring men who wished to nip at weakness. Whatever crested the hill would find him upright. He leaned close to Jonah and said quietly, "We'll see this through." The old man did not stir, yet the words felt necessary, as if a sleeping ear needed promise as much as a waking one needed plan. Sarah squeezed Emily's shoulder and moved to the door, not to open it, only to stand where welcome and refusal both begin. The lamp flame danced once, then held. The cabin drew itself inward, gathering strength the way a tree gathers sap before spring. On a night like this, waiting was work. Ethan did that work with his jaw set and his hands clean, eyes on the latch, mind on the wire, heart balanced between doubt and hope while the stove flickered and the cold pressed its face against every seam of their small, stubborn home. He kept watch and refused to bend. A sound reached Ethan before he named it. A measured drumming threaded through the wind, steady and close. He lifted a hand and Sarah paused with the kettle, while Emily's eyes widened. Hoofbeats rolled down the lane and stopped. Leather creaked, iron chimed once, and a quiet command settled a horse. Ethan unbarred the door to a man, and a stallion black as new coal, steam feathering from both. The rider swung down in one motion, tall, broad-shouldered, coat frosted. He carried distance in his stance. His gloved knuckles tapped once, out of courtesy more than need. "Walsh?" he asked. Inside, Ethan said, stepping aside. Weather came with the stranger sharp and clean. He crossed to the bed where Jonah lay and knelt, a hand hovering above the old man's temple before resting there lightly, as if permission still mattered. Lines around the rider's mouth eased. He exhaled a long-held breath. "Tai," he said softly, the word wearing relief and restraint. Jonah's eyelids fluttered. Clarity edged in like lamplight under a door. For a heartbeat he wavered. Then recognition steadied him. "Dan," he whispered. The man pressed his brow to Jonah's knuckles for a second, then pulled back, composure returning to hold feeling steady. The stallion stamped once outside, then quieted. He looked at Ethan. "Daniel Carver," he said. No boast rode the name, fact filled the room. Carver's gaze swept the cabin with a second look's accuracy. Mending laid aside, a neat stack of split wood, potatoes lined on the table like coins waiting for a better purse. A child's star-stitched blanket given to a stranger. The poverty did not shame the place. It gave the air a gravity he respected. "You pulled him from a killing wind," he said to Ethan. "Tell me what you saw." Ethan gave the short story, the shadow at Red Canyon Pass, the bracelet's code, the run to the telegraph, the operator's reply. He kept it spare. Carver asked 2 questions about time and direction, then let silence do the rest. He turned back to Jonah and touched his shoulder. "We'll have you home soon," he said. Jonah nodded. Gratitude unshowy yet certain. Carver reached inside his coat and drew a small leather pouch. He weighed it once, then offered it to Sarah across the table. "For expenses," he said. "Wood, food, medicine. The night cost you." Pride moved across Sarah's face like weather over hills. For a breath she didn't lift her hands. Ethan watched that familiar pinch at her mouth, the one that appeared whenever aid came wrapped in pity. Carver did not press. He let her decide how dignity would stand. She reached and took the pouch as a responsibility, not a favor. "We'll put it to use," she said. The sentence carried steadiness. Carver inclined his head. He faced Ethan again, studying him the way a cattleman studies a horse's stance before bothering with its teeth. "You got him here in one piece in a storm most men would use to justify selfishness," he said. "What work do you keep?" Ethan answered without embroidery. "Fence when paid. Gentle horse breaking, hauling wood, mucking stalls, fixing a gate that sagged near his path." Carver listened like someone who knows what each task asks from a back and a will. "You handle rope?" he asked. "I can," Ethan said. "Keep your seat on a fresh colt?" "I do. Watch a line and see breaks before cattle teach you where they are." "I try to see trouble while it's small." Sarah's mouth twitched, proud without spectacle. "Good," Carver said, almost to himself. He set 2 fingers on the bed rail as if anchoring intent. "I've met hands with clean gloves who could talk a mile and ride half of. I prefer men who carry miles in their eyes." He nodded toward Ethan's patched sleeves. "You wear yours without noise." Hooves sounded again outside, softer now, as if riders had dismounted and were leading stock. Carver glanced at the door without worry. "My foreman and a hand," he explained. "They'll bring a travois. We won't jostle him more than we must. If you have blankets to spare, I'll send them back tomorrow." "We have 2 that hold heat best," Sarah said. "Take them. Return them when you can." Carver accepted her terms. He warmed his hands, untied another small roll from inside his coat, set it on the table and looked at Ethan. "A place like this keeps decency running on fumes," he said. "You didn't wait for invitation. Ethan held his gaze and felt an old door move on its hinges. He had imagined futures that winter, none generous. "I've wanted a place where a man earns by being useful," he said. Carver's mouth ticked at one corner, more acknowledgement than smile. Boots thudded on the porch. The foreman, broad and quiet, stepped in with a handline. A younger rider followed with a rolled canvas rig. They tipped hats to Sarah and Emily, and waited for Carver's word. He gave it in few words. The men worked with gentle economy, setting the canvas near the bed, securing poles, checking knots as if each could be the difference between safe and sorry. Carver helped his father sit, then eased him onto the travois, every motion respectful. Jonah's breath hitched once, then steady. Carver turned back to Ethan. He shook Ethan's hand, not to erase debt, but to measure a man. The grip was warm, steady, brief. "You did right," he said. "Right gets noticed." Ethan lacked words that wouldn't shrink the moment. He nodded once. Carver released his hand and memorized the cabin with a last glance. As if he might need to describe it later. He lifted his chin toward the pouch, then added, "I have room for a man who sees trouble while it's small." His eyes flicked to Sarah and back to Ethan, leaving the rest unsaid but very near. The promise felt like a gate left unlatched. Outside, harness jingled. The foreman ducked in. "Trail's clear," he said. Carver nodded, then raised Jonah's gaze to meet him. "We'll talk more at daylight," he told Ethan. As if daylight had been invited. He touched the brim of his hat to Sarah and Emily, then moved with his men, guiding the travois through the door into the bright cold. Quiet followed the important sound. The room felt larger for the absence, and smaller for the weight of what had been offered without being named. Sarah opened the pouch, counted quickly and closed it with a practiced snap, eyes bright. "It will carry us through the turn," she said. Emily pressed her hands to her cheeks, and whispered that the black horse looked like a cloud tied to night. Ethan set the bar across the door again, felt the wood's familiar strength, and looked at his mother. Something like summer moved under his rib. He had carried a stranger through winter, and watched a son kneel beside a father without wasting a word. Outside, hoofbeats faded toward the road that points everywhere worth going. Inside, the stove lifted a taller flame as if it had heard the offer left in the air. How does it feel to see kindness rewarded unexpectedly? Morning arrived pale over Dustorn, turning the snow into old light and drawing thin lines along rooftops that had carried too many storms. Ethan fed the stove, checked the latch and stepped into the lane with the ache-along winter leaves in a back, only to see Daniel Carver ride up with his foreman, both dusted with frost and purpose. They dismounted and nodded, men who had spoken through a wire and were ready to finish that conversation in person. Carver entered the cabin, removed his gloves, and took in everything again with that careful second look. The patched walls, the neat stack of wood, the few bowls set upside down like coins waiting for work. Sarah poured coffee as if the act itself were hospitality made visible, and Emily hovered close to the table, trying to contain a joy that kept escaping her eyes. Carver warmed his hands and studied Ethan openly. "You kept my father breathing," he said. "I meant what I hinted at last night. Come to Carver Ranch. I will pay steady wages, and there is a small house by the creek, room and board for your family, work that respects a man who shows up before dawn and leaves the gate better than he found it." The room held its breath. Ethan felt hope tugging one arm and caution tugging the other. He glanced at Sarah and Emily, then at the stove that had given what it could. "Sir, I cannot leave them," he said. "They are the measure I keep." Carver nodded, neither impatient nor surprised. "They will not be left," he answered. "The house stands ready. Wages begin the day you sign on. You will not owe rent, you will owe only honest work, and that seems to be your habit already." Sarah looked down to hide the start of tears and failed, because relief is a stubborn river when a life has been dry. Emily clutched the back of a chair and bit her lip so she would not shout. Ethan took one slow breath, then another, weighing loyalty against opportunity and finding they could walk together. "We will come," he said, and the words fit him like a coat cut right. Carver's foreman, a square man with winter in his beard, stepped forward. "I brought a wagon," he said. "We can move you before noon if you like." Sarah wiped her cheeks, and set her jaw the way she did whenever a hard task turned into simple work. "We like," she said. Then the room became a workshop. Ethan folded quilts, tied bundles, wrapped bowls in rags, and stacked the last split wood by the stove out of courtesy for whatever soul might follow. Sarah lifted the mending tin, a sewing box, 2 cups, and a jar that still held 3 peppermints Emily saved for birthday. Emily gathered her doll, a slate, a chalk nub, and the star blanket that had warmed Jonah through the worst hour. They moved in a rhythm born of years of scarcity, quick but not frantic, careful but not timid. Ethan paused at the door to look once at the wall where his father's knife had nicked the wood during a joke he barely remembered. He pressed 2 fingers to the spot, then shouldered the bundle and went out to the wagon. Morning clarified the town. The church bell wore a clear icicle, the mercantile window laced itself with frost, and the breezewood slept off its noise. Lucas Brennan came out yawning, wrapped in a scarf too fine for weather that does not flatter silk. He spotted Carver's foreman and straightened his mouth into something like respect, then found Ethan and let a familiar curl return. Ethan looked past him, not because of fear but because the horizon was finally speaking a language he understood. Bundles settled, ropes cinched tight, and the wagon eased forward, iron ringing soft and crisp over ruts. Sarah locked the door, handed the key to a neighbor with instructions, and touched the lintel with a goodbye she did not say aloud. Snow hissed under wheel. Dustorn thinned behind them, until it looked like a line drawn by a tired hand. The road bent along a shallow creek whose skin of ice held reeds like pins through glass. Crows hopped and scolded, then lifted away like scraps of the night refusing to surrender. Ethan breathed air that had not been used by a room, and something inside him stood taller. Humiliations lost their shine as distance unbraided them. He did not feel grand, he felt clean. Carver rode ahead to set the gate open and the kitchen ready. The foreman steered with the patience of a man who measures miles by the mood of horses, rather than a clock. Emily learned every turn by heart in case stories later needed maps. Sarah counted bundles twice, then looked at the horizon and stopped counting because the view would not fit number. Carver Ranch came into being the way some truths do, slowly and then all at once. Fences ran straight as judgment, barns sat square on stone, a windbreak of spruce shouldered the north. Smoke lifted from the big house in an obedient line. They crossed a small bridge where water whispered under ice, and a modest home appeared near a bend, a porch with a railing smooth from hands, a door painted the color of dry wheat, two windows that faced morning. Ethan felt his chest hitch. The place did not apologize for itself, it invited you. They stopped. The foreman carried bundles to the porch and left them there, giving the family the grace of first entry. Ethan opened the door, waited for Sarah and Emily, and stepped inside last, because beginnings like to witness humility. The floor held firm under his boot. The stove stood ready with a trivet and a kettle already hung. Cabinets waited with pegs for cups, pegs for coats, pegs for hope. Through the back window, the creek showed a ribbon of moving black where the current refused the eye. Sarah touched the counter and exhaled a sound that was neither a laugh nor a sob, but a mixture that belongs to thresholds. Emily spun once, then remembered herself and stopped, palms flat, eyes wide, as if she had walked into a story that would not throw her out. Ethan tested the latch on the bedroom window, pressed a foot against the bed frame, and found no complaint. He set the bundles down and began to turn a shell into a home. Quilts took beds, bowls met shelves, the sewing tin found a corner, the slate leaned against a beam that would one day carry Emily's taller marks. Sarah placed dried sage by the stove because even new rooms deserve familiar scent. Emily tucked her doll near the pillow and asked whether the creek sang at night. Ethan told her she would learn its song by spring. Carver appeared in the doorway with his hat in hand, not to intrude but to make welcome visible. Supplies are coming, he said. Flour, beans, salt, coffee, lard, soap. The cow boss will expect you at first light tomorrow. Take today to settle and tell the foreman if a tool is missing. Ethan nodded. Thank you, he said, meaning more than the words could carry. Carver's face softened by a nod. You earned this morning, he replied. Let it know you. He left them to the quiet that follows a gift that fits. Outside the light flurried and then held. Ethan stepped to the porch and looked across the pasture toward dark cattle humped against cold and hands moving with purpose at the far corrals. He could see the shape of days gathering, early coffee, saddle leather creaking, a gait that sticks until it learns his name, a colt that watches him for cues, a foreman who speaks 10 words when 10 will do, pay counted on schedule, supper that sits on a table not afraid of winter. He saw Sarah at the window with steam on the glass, and a plan in her hands. He saw Emily tracking constellations from the porch while the windmill clicked a slow metronome for whatever song the creek decided to play. Warm hope rose and settled like a good blanket. It did not burn, it held. He went back inside and lifted the last bundle from the floor. Emily lifted her arms and he swung her once, because strength should celebrate the chance to carry joy. Sarah opened the window a finger's width, and let the ranch air enter, clean and honest. She laughed again, this time without apology. Ethan stood in the middle of the room that would be theirs and understood that sorrow had not been wasted. It had built a place in him where gratitude could stand without wobbling. He looked at the door, at the creek, at the stove, at the people who were the reason every mile mattered, and felt a promise take root to show up early, to ride straight, to mend what breaks, to be better than the world, and to let this new start prove that mercy can live as policy, not accident. Outside the wind brushed the porch rail like a hand learning a name. Inside a family unpacked its small life and found it larger than it had ever been. Carver Ranch opened like a horizon finally allowed to speak. Fences arrowing over low hills, barns braced to weather, corrals tight and honest. The creek beside the modest house ran dark under thinning ice, whispering over stones as if practicing a song for spring. Sarah stood on the porch with one hand on the rail and breathed air that did not taste of trapped smoke. Emily pressed her palms to the window and watched a windmill turn slow, counting each click as if it were a promise. Ethan, sore from miles but taller in spirit, carried the last bundle inside and set it by the stove that stood ready like a well-trained mule. The room held clean space, shelves that wanted use, a table that did not wobble. He started before dawn, coffee hot enough to wake bone, rope coiled neat, gloves mended one more time. At the barn, skeptical eyes measured him, men with dust in their seams and caution in their posture. A red mare tested him with the white of one eye, then settled when he spoke low. He brushed until hair lay smooth, saddled without fuss, and rode out with the foreman, whose sentences came trimmed to essentials. They checked ice on tanks, counted calves, eased a gate that stuck, and set a salt block where it would matter. By noon Ethan's shoulders carried the ranch's distances, the way a good beam carries a roof, without complaint, without show. Sarah learned the kitchen stove and the stubborn soil on the same morning. She tested the garden with a trowel, lifted a clod, breathed its damp iron smell and smiled because seeds would listen here. She placed cups on pegs, set quilts to air and opened the door so the creek's quiet voice could join the room while she worked. Emily traced sunlight patches across the floor, named each for something she loved, then claimed the smallest corner for drawing maps of places the creek might visit. Daniel Carver rode the pastures with Ethan twice that week, not to hover but to see which questions the young man asked. Ethan talked water first, then grass, then fence. He noted wire that sagged where snow had bullied it and posts that leaned like tired men. Carver handed him a ledger: track repairs, schedule crews, mark weak gates, keep salt where hooves gather. The first time Ethan wrote in that book, numbers felt like handles instead of needles. He delivered lists at day's end without excuses. Trust began to collect like silt in a slow bend, hard to notice by the hour, undeniable by the week. On clearer days Jonah Reed stood by the porch rail or sat near the corral on a blanket, cane across his knees, eyes bright with the odd mix of apology and pride men carry when memory loosens. He raised a hand when Ethan passed, the gesture saying, "Everything you brought me home to my name, and I see you." Ethan returned the wave and kept moving because gratitude prefers grace to speeches. Winter loosened its grip, finger by finger. Sage gave scent when brushed, cottonwoods feathered pale green and the ridge traded brown for color that meant the ground remembered favors. Calves bucked for no reason but joy. Ethan rode fence until the map in his head matched the world, mending with a rhythm that steadied him. He gentled a nervous roan by asking, not forcing, teaching the horse that a hand can guide without lying. The foreman watched unapplauding, and then on a quiet afternoon, handed Ethan a string of colts that needed miles. He took them out and returned them listening. Carver measured progress by the absence of chaos and the way tempers stayed folded at dusk. He began sending Ethan in his stead to meet a supplier, to walk the ditch with the waterman, to tally a shipment with the rail agent. Ethan brought back notes and questions and no stories meant to cover mistakes. Respect traveled ahead of him after that. Not loud, just certain. The crew started asking his opinion before they spent nail. He answered in short sentences and then worked alongside whoever had to carry the answer into the field. Evenings belonged to the porch while the creek explained itself. Sarah's hands healed. The raw cracks that winter had written across her knuckles faded to thin white lines. She cooked beans with onion and baked bread that made the house smell like relief. Emily learned 3 constellations and renamed one for the windmill. Ethan read dog-eared almanacs Carver loaned him, finding in those pages a logic the land had been saying all along. Some nights Jonah told a short story about flood years and drought years in the way patience saves more cattle than shouting. They listened until the frogs took up the low part and the creek sang lead. A hard storm threw hail one afternoon, rattling the roof like seeds in a tin. The crew drew tarps, shifted stock and waited with the practiced calm of men who have been argued with by weather before. When the sun returned the world looked scrubbed. Jonah stepped under the eaves and drank cold drops from the edge like a boy learning delight again. Ethan rode out to check the far line and came back wet and grinning because the fence had held where he had guessed it might fail. Proof that careful attention outworks luck. Spring wrote its name with a consistent hand. Ethan kept the ledger current, trained a new hire to move quietly, and corrected a small account error without apology. The next day he handed Ethan a key to the tack room and said, "You know which saddles are honest. Sign them." It was not ceremony, it was trust dressed in a scent. Ethan accepted with a nod that hid an inner blaze and set about ordering small things so big things would behave. On Sundays they walked the creek's curve and let quiet do its work. Emily clipped willow switches for weave. Sarah planned a trellis for beans and cut seed potatoes with the satisfaction of opening a bank she could add to with a shovel. Jonah counted fence posts and announced the number like a victory over fog. Ethan woke before birds and slept with a fatigue that felt like on. He dreamed less about hunger and more about seasons that could be named ahead of time. The ranch never turned soft. Wind kept its authority. Work insisted on attention every hour a man dared to claim as his own, yet the harshness had context now. It did not feel like punishment aimed at the poor, it felt like a partnership that demanded honesty and paid dignity. Ethan carried that bargain in his shoulders and in his voice. He rarely raised it. Results did the loud part for him. One bright evening, as swallows stitched the air, Jonah lifted his cane toward the corral where Ethan closed a gate. "You belong," he said, clear as a bell rescued from winter. Ethan breathed once, then twice, letting the words settle like rain into ground ready for sea. Imagine starting anew after hardship. What would you build? 6 months after the night at Red Canyon Pass, the ranch breathed like a living thing. Snow had retreated into high gullies. Grass pushed green at fence lines, and the creek beside the small house ran under cottonwood shade. On a Easted afternoon, Jonah Reed sat straight in a porch chair, cane across his knees. Ethan leaned on the rail while the windmill ticked a count over work already done. "Son," Jonah said, voice firm, "I want it spoken while my head's clear. Daniel means to do right by you. Not only wages, a stake, partner." The words seemed larger than the porch and exactly the right size. Ethan eased onto the step to keep steady. "Partner." He let the syllables sit in his mouth like water after a long ride. He saw fence corners rebuilt, tanks kept open through late cold, ledger lines written clean. He remembered Dustorn, the boy counting coins for potatoes and leaving soap on the counter because pride cannot be boiled for supper. Jonah watched him as a father watches a son without using the word. "A place like this should be kept by men who see trouble while it's small," he said. "Daniel's no fool. He knows what your kind of careful buys." He patted Ethan's wrist, grip steady despite months of drifting memory. "You hauled me out of killing wind. Since then you've kept pulling this land toward sense." The wind shifted warm. Sarah stepped out with 2 cups and a look that had learned rest. The raw cracks winter carved in her hands had faded. Peace had settled at the corners of her mouth. She sat on the top step. Below the porch, Emily crouched by a square of soil bordered with stones and marigolds, whispering to 2 bean sprouts shaped like green hooks. "Did you tell him?" Sarah asked. "I did," Jonah said, pleased to have done the task while his mind was clear. Sarah's eyes bright. She anchored Ethan with a touch at his sleeve. "Daniel is cautious," she said, "but not blind. He recognizes a man whose word arrives before his shadow." Ethan drank and let gratitude warm his chest. He remembered the silver bracelet's code, the grumpy operator, the first knock on their old door, the sack so light it had embarrassed him. He remembered Lucas Brennan's curled laugh and how, last week, it thinned when Daniel handed Ethan a ledger in view of the saloon. Respect had arrived quiet and stayed. Hoofbeats approached at a thoughtful pace. Daniel Carver swung down, looped reins and climbed the steps with his hat in his hand. He greeted Sarah by name, nodded to Jonah, then turned to Ethan with the steadiness of a man who had already chosen and now intended to make the choice visible. "My father probably stole my line," he said. "Not sorry. I want you where decisions live, not just chores. A neighbor is selling heifers before heading west. We should stretch and buy. I need a partner who will argue fair when I'm wrong and stand firm when I'm right. You fit." Ethan set his cup on the rail. The ranch drew one long breath. "I'll carry what the work asks," he said. "I'll argue fair." Carver offered his hand. Ethan took it. The shake was simple, firm, final. A different life settled between their palms. Emily popped up with dirt on her knees. "They're up," she cried, lifting the sprouts. Jonah laughed once, quick as a boy. Carver smiled with his eyes, then let responsibility take its seat again. They spoke numbers, pastures, water and rail dates. Ethan answered straight and asked what mattered. When talk ended, Carver touched his hat brim. "Supper at the big house," he said. "Bring question." He left them to the porch in the mile of quiet a good decision throws around a home. Silence filled with birds and creek music. Ethan looked across the yard and allowed the truth to settle. The boy with cracked boots and a flour sack light as shame had become a man whose name meant reliability before it meant need. The change was not luck. It was the arithmetic of mercy. One cold night he had opened a door for a stranger and spent from a thin that yes had multiplied, first into warmth, then wages, then trust and now into a stake. He thought of Lucas, not with heat but with distance. The saloon still produced laughter that tried to cut, yet it no longer decided whether inside Ethan's chest. The rail agent now tipped his cap first. The blacksmith fixed a rivet ahead of schedule. A miner's wife sent a boy with eggs because she heard Ethan kept accounts straight. Respect had learned his doorstep. Sarah watched laundry sway on the line. "Peace fits here," she said. "It doesn't slip." She named quiet victories. Coffee that did not require apology. A pantry that could feed guests. Sleep that reached morning. She touched Ethan's shoulder. "We will need a trellis. I'll set posts before supper," he said. "Bench on the north side so the reader doesn't squint." "East," Emily called, without looking up. "Seeds like sunrise." She knew seeds watched nothing and everything and blushed anyway. Jonah tapped his cane like a metronome for hope. "Good things need keepers, not owners," he said. "You'll keep this place honest." The wind turned softer. Cottonwoods began a thin green shimmer along each twig. Calves kicked for the joy of it, then ducked under their mothers as a cloud slid across the field. Work still asked the same price. Early, steady, careful, but it paid dignity now, not just exhaustion. Ethan felt that truth seated itself in his bones the way heat from a full stove settles a room. He looked at Jonah. "I won't waste what's being handed." "I know," Jonah said. "A man doesn't waste what he bled to carry." Evening sidled in with gold along the fence wire. Bats practiced cursive over the pasture. The windmill clicked. The creek kept its patient song. Ethan rose, offered Sarah his arm and reached for Emily's. She slid her fingers into his with the confidence of someone who has learned the ground will hold. At the gate he paused and glanced back. The house wore lamplight without apology. The garden waited for posts. The hills kept their patient line. The future no longer felt like a wall. It looked like a track chosen by work and character. He squeezed Emily's hand and felt her answer. Kindness had left a cramped cabin and returned as room to breathe. It had come back with wages, trust and invitation, then asked to be sent out again in the way they would run herd, pay on time, listen first, and give second chances where sense allowed. That was multiplication he could believe in. One act becoming many until a whole life bore its shape. 6 months ago he led an old man toward town. Today that man's son led Ethan toward ownership. Mercy made a circle and widened it. He stepped toward the gate. Stars salted the Wyoming sky, while the ranch settled into its night chorus. Cattle shifting, windmill ticking, creek murmuring over stones. Ethan sat on the porch steps beside Sarah and Emily, boots on the lower plank, hat near his knee, the ledger closed because numbers had earned their rest. Cool air smelled of hay and leather. Emily leaned into him and watched the vein turn. "Do you wish the night at the pass had gone differently?" she asked. He looked past corrals he had mended, the barn roof he had patched, the modest house by the creek wearing light without apology, and measured the question the way he measured weather, honestly without drama. "Kindness made me who I am," he said. "It made this place possible." She nodded, then traced the grain of the step with 2 fingers. Memory climbed the hill and sat, snow lifting at Red Canyon, a gaunt face, cracked lips. A silver bracelet that gleamed in candlelight, numbers marching like rails. Sarah's steady hands, Emily's star blanket. The operator waking, tapping a message that ran through sleeping towns toward a name the territory respected. Riders appearing, reunion contained yet fierce. A pouch that bought wood and food. A wagon that turned a cramped life toward a creek and work that answered back. Sarah's hand found his sleeve. "You did not change into someone else," she said. "You became more of yourself." He breathed and felt the truth settle like weight that steadies rather than presses. Work had not softened. Dawn still demanded attention. Colts still tested hands. Wire still sagged after storms. Water still asked watching. Yet the hardness no longer felt like punishment aimed at the poor, it felt like a bargain: bring honesty and care, get dignity and bread. Daniel had watched, placed a ledger in Ethan's hands, then said, "Partner," without a speech. Jonah, clear more days than not, sat by the corral, cane across his knees, gratitude riding his gaze like a rider. He remembered Lucas Brennan's curled laugh outside the mercantile and realized the sound no longer lived inside his bones. Lucas still told jokes that asked an audience to purchase small cruelty, but their power had drained away. A rail agent now tipped his cap first. The blacksmith set a rivet without delay. A miner's wife sent eggs after hearing that Ethan kept accounts square. Kindness had multiplied into reputation, and reputation had turned into trust the crew could spend without asking permission. Emily pointed toward the garden. Bean vines climbed posts he had set. A green handwriting the wind read and answered. "Tomorrow they open," she whispered. "Then bees will come." He pictured morning petals out, creek brighter, coffee waiting, tools by the door, a day shaped by choices instead of fear. "They will," he said. "Bees like honest work." She grinned and tucked herself under Sarah's arm. He named the ripple moving through their life. A cabin taught loyalty, the wire taught resolve, the reunion taught proportion, wages taught stewardship, the house taught welcome, the ledger taught attention, the word partner taught humility. Each lesson carried another door, and each door opened toward a wider horizon. With position came obligation: keep salt where hooves gather, keep wire tight where snow bullies, keep water honest, pay on time and steady tempers before sparks jump. The wind shifted warm, cottonwoods murmured like rain. Sarah exhaled a thin note of private joy. Emily traced Orion and renamed one bright star for the windmill, because children may revise heaven. Ethan lifted his face to the sky, and let distance reset his proportions. He was one man among many, on acres that would outlast him, held by a family that would remember choices more than talk. He returned to Emily's question, because important answers deserve repetition. "If I had walked past that old man," he said, "we would still be measuring nights by how hard the wind hits the walls. I would still be hauling wood for coins that shrink. The past would have taken more than one life. It would have taken our future." He paused. Kindness bent the night toward us. Beyond the trees, coyotes tuned their chords. The creek kept its patient tempo. He thought of the people still out there. A boy with a sack too light. A woman making soup from hope. A girl ready to give away the blanket that keeps her warm. He wanted them to hear a steady truth carried across open ground. Compassion is not foolishness. It is strategy. It builds bridges where pride burns them. It turns wire into lifeline. It finds riders, warms rooms and teaches ledgers to become promises. It does not always look grand, but it never returns empty. He stood, paced the porch once and knelt by Emily's garden square. The earth kept its cool even after a long day. He imagined jars on a shelf where scarcity once stared back. He imagined hiring a boy who reminded him of himself and teaching him to see trouble while it is small. He imagined buying heifers with Daniel and walking the ditch with the waterman while spring ran high. He imagined riding to town and meeting Lucas without heat, spending courtesy without spending pride. He sat again and let the porch hold their weight. "Listen," he said. They stilled. "Wind, water, hoof, night. That's our life telling us we chose right. If you are standing at a pass with a choice biting your hands numb, carry somebody. If you have a blanket, share it. If you have strength, spend it on mercy first. The return will not look like love. It will look like work that fits, doors that open, and rooms that welcome your name." The lamp sparked, steadied, and threw a soft ring across the planks. Emily's head found his shoulder. Sarah leaned into his arm. He understood that life would keep asking him to spend what he had on someone else's need. He decided to answer yes while his hands still worked and his words still mattered. He rose, took his hat and studied the sky until the stars sharpened. "One small act can change a life," he said. "What will your next kind act be?" The night listened closely. The wind carried the scent of sage. He thought of dawn, horses waiting, notes for Daniel about water and grass, Jonah's chair near the corral, Sarah's bread cooling on a rack she had not owned 6 months ago, Emily's beans opening like little green hands. He thought of the pass, the wire, the riders, the handshake that turned wages into a stake, and felt gratitude settle. The stars held their posts like faithful watchmen above all night, so steady. He looked at Sarah and Emily, at the home glowing behind them, at Fields asking for stewardship and promising honest return. Purpose squared his shoulder. He felt the future lean close, willing to be shaped by patience, courage, and the rule that had carried him from frost to abundance. Be better than the world. He squeezed Emily's fingers, tucked Sarah's hand into his elbow, and stepped inside so the lamp could rest. What happened next for Ethan will shock you.